Praise the Lord. Welcome to the channel. In today's video, we are going to review Psalm chapter 18. So, this psalm is also written by King David and it consists of 50 verses. Now, let's start reviewing. This is a very special psalm. It is so special that you will find it in two places in the Bible. It is here in the book of Psalms, that is Psalms chapter 18. It is also in a part of the Bible that we call the book of Samuel, that is in Samuel in the second part. First Samuel tells the story of David before he became king of Israel. Second Samuel tells us the story of David after he became king. First Samuel also tells us about the lives of Samuel the prophet and Saul the king. Why is Psalm chapter 18 is in the book of Samuel, that is in 2 Samuel chapter 22? Because it is David's own story of his life. Here we can see in 2 Samuel chapter 22 verse 1, David sang to the Lord the words of this song when the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. So he is getting excited from all his enemies and he is free from all his enemies and main enemy King Saul. Here we have put it in 5 different parts. This gives help to everyone who listens to this review. We can study this Psalm chapter 18 like that. But we must read this whole psalm to understand the life of David. That is why it is also in the book of 2 Samuel. Psalms chapter 18 describes in picture how God works. David did not see God. David only saw how God gave him help. We can see some examples. David called God a rock. God was not really a rock, but when David needed help, God led David to a rock. David hid from his enemies behind the rock, so David thought that God and the rock did the same job. When David saw a rock, he remembered God. Can you think of other ways that rocks make us remember God? Or any other thing which make you to remember God? Comment it about it. Second example, God sent a bad storm to the enemies of David. There was rain, wind, clouds, hail, thunder, and lightning. To David, God was in the storm. God was enjoying it. The thunder was like God speaking. The storm obeyed God and it destroyed the enemies of David. So when David saw a storm, he remembered God. So, as I said, this Psalm chapter 18 consists of 50 verses. We can broadly classify it into 2 parts. We will divide into 2. First half consists of first 19 verses and the second part consists of verses 20 to verses 50. So today we will deal with first part, in which first 3 verses David triumphs in God, and in verses 4 to 19 David magnifies the deliverances God had wrought for him. Now let's start reviewing verse by verse. Psalm chapter 18, for the director of music, of David the servant of the Lord. He sang to the Lord the words of this song when the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. He said, verse 1, I love you, O Lord, my strength. Verse 2, the Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer. My God is my rock, in whom I take refuge. He is my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. David calls God as rock, and many times he calls with different names to show what God is like. David hid from his enemies in the woods and fields and hills. He hid behind rocks and on the tops of hills. They were like fortresses. They were like the high towers that soldiers made. David said that they were like the shields that soldiers hid behind. They all made David remember God. How mighty is our God! He is our shield and He is our refuge. Verse 3, I called to the Lord who is worthy of praise, and I am saved from my enemies. Verse 4, the cords of death entangled me, the torrents of destruction overwhelmed me. Verse 5, the cords of the grave coiled around me, the snares of death confronted me. David had many enemies. There was Saul and the friends of Goliath and Cush. There were many others, even David's own son Absalom. They all wanted to kill David. This made David feel like a drowning man. He thought that he would soon be in Sheol, that is, grave, where the dead people would be found. So he asked God for help. So, in these 5 verses, God is considered to be a rock for David, and he asks for help from the God to get saved from his enemies. Now, verse 6, in my distress, I called to the Lord, I cried to my God for help. From his temple, he heard my voice, my cry came before him into his ears. Verse 7, the earth trembled and quaked, and the foundations of the mountains shook. They trembled because he was angry. So God hears our prayers too in our distress and in stress. So from his temple, in the sense from his presence, he lent his ears to our cry. And God gave David help by sending an earthquake. This is when the earth moves and breaks. Buildings would tend to fall. And this has shook the mountains too because of God's angriness. So God is fighting for us. Now verse 8, smoke rose from his nostrils, consuming fire came from his mouth, burning coals blast out of it. Verse 9, he parted the heavens and came down, dark clouds were under his feet. Verse 10, he mounted the cherubim and flew, he soared on the wings of the wind. Verse 11, he made darkness his covering, his canopy around him, the dark rain clouds of the sky. Verse 12, out of the brightness of his presence, clouds advanced with hailstones and bolts of lightning. Verse 13, the Lord thundered from heaven, the voice of the Most High resounded. Verse 14, he shoot his arrows and scattered the enemies, great bolts of lightning and routed them. So here we can see the entire picture of God, which is entitled by David. God gave David help by sending a great storm. The home of God is in heaven, though he is residing in us. In general, he is in heaven. The Jews believed that heaven was above the sky. David thought that the storm was God coming down to earth. God made people afraid. People, in the sense, those who are against David here. Now, verse 15, the valleys of the sea were exposed, and the foundations of the earth laid bare. At your rebuke, O Lord, at the blast of breath from your nostrils. So the earthquake and the storm were so bad that the people saw under the mountains and under the sea. So God's power can break the mighty mountains and can scatter the sea and make it open as it made open for Israelites for the crossing the Red Sea. Now verse 16, he reached down from on high and took hold of me. He drew me out of deep waters. Verse 17, he rescued me from my powerful enemy, from my foes who were too strong for me. Verse 18, they confronted me in the day of my disaster, but the Lord was my support. Verse 19, he brought me out into a spacious place. He rescued me because he delighted in me. So God used earthquakes and storms to give help to King David. God saved David from danger, and God put David in a safe place from all these disasters which has entirely demolished his powerful enemies. And that's what God says. God answers King David in this part. So the first part is over. So what we come across this Psalm chapter 18's first part is God lends his ears to us and he will destroy our enemies who is against us, but we must be faithful to the Lord and we must be obedient to our Lord in any situations. So that's it for today's Psalm chapter review series. We will see the next part of this chapter review. Until then, may God bless you all.